Hello, friends, and thank you for being with us here for this very special webinar on why childhood trauma is so hard to heal. We have over 10,000 people who have opted in to join us for this session, and this is obviously a topic that is very resonant and very important to so many of us. My name's Tami Simon. I'm the founder of Sounds True, and I'm joined for this webinar by friend and guiding teacher of Sounds True's Healing Trauma program, Dr. Jeffrey Rutstein. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Rutstein. He's a clinical psychologist and an expert in the treatment of trauma. He's a certified Hakomi, mindful somatic psychotherapist, and he's a meditation teacher who's been in private practice for over 39 years. The other day when Dr. Rutstein and I were talking, he shared with me that he was reviewing some of his notes over the past 39 years and that he did a calculation. Okay, get ready for this. He has done 72,000 hours of clinical practice in the area of healing trauma. 72,000 hours. Holy gosh. And he's poured all of that clinical knowledge into the design of Sounds True's 9-month healing trauma program. We'll be hearing more about that. There's a robust guest faculty joining Dr. Rutstein for the 9-month online immersion, including Dr. Gabor Mate, well known for his expertise in the area of healing trauma, author of the book, The Myth of Normal, Deb Dana, who's someone who wrote a book with Sounds True called Anchored, and is an expert in making polyvagal theory accessible and practical. Resma Menakem, the author of the book, My Grandmother's Hands, an expert in the area of healing racialized trauma, and more. You can learn more about the Healing Trauma 9-month program. It begins in February, so it begins soon by pressing the Learn More button on the player page. If you're with us here in Zoom, we'll put the link in chat, and we hope to see many of you join us for this program. We only run it once each year, and as I mentioned, it begins in February. Now we're going to move to our topic, why childhood trauma is so hard to heal. You might wonder, how did we come up with this being the topic of this third webinar in our 3-part webinar series? And it's because we heard from so many members of our community that this was the topic that they were most interested in learning more about. And Dr. Rutstein, here, right as we start, I wanted to get an understanding from you about why is childhood trauma so hard to heal? And let me say a little bit more. I think a lot of us at this point have some level of awareness of what happened to us in our childhood. Some people not, I'm sure, but many of us are like, I could tell you about my childhood trauma. I have some understanding. The healing of it in a deep and thorough way seems extremely elusive, difficult. Help me understand that gap.
So I think that there's an evolution in our understanding of trauma that parallels this. When I first started working in trauma in the 1980s, the only real tools we had was traditional talk therapy and hypnosis. And those were very useful in helping people move from a tremendous amount of activation to becoming less activated over their life and to have much more insight into what's causing their problems, their symptoms, and the events that were traumatic and harmful to them. But what we found is that while people had resounding insight and a real ability to see things in perspective, their nervous system was still responding at times, especially when triggered, as if it was still in the past. So suddenly someone could be overwhelmed by feelings of shame or rage or fear, or of just feeling, I was going to get up and go out, but now I have to go back to bed. that we found the disruptions that occur from trauma in the nervous system are the longest lasting. And because they're not as noisy as being loudly triggered, like having a panic attack or feeling massively suicidal, these are quieter things that are almost like they become the water that we swim in. And we just feel like, well, this is as good as it gets. We sort of settle for a new normal, which is still far from us thriving, right? We're not as tortured and tormented and as we may have been in earlier years if some people have already done some work, but they're going to find that there's still ways they're not fully inhabiting their life, or that they're still living with some prejudices or tendernesses from the past. So these things that maintain in the nervous system are a tendency to easily get angry, easily get frightened, worried, anxious, overwhelmed, easily go into retreat and shut down or shame. And that trauma survivors spend a lot of their time going between these two sort of high points and low points in their inner energy, the sympathetic high energy of anger and fright, and the what we call dorsal energy, this lower level energy that also has us more withdrawn, less connected with other people, less connected with ourselves, and more buried in a darker, deep mood. And so many of these people so many of these symptoms, people do not associate directly with trauma because it's not noisy. It's not like I'm feeling like I'm going to get attacked or I see a gun and I'm getting triggered. This is just what I live with every day. But these are the longest reaching tendrils of trauma. And as Gabor had pointed out too, right? Like no one had really looked before him at the relationship between addiction and trauma. And there is such a profound linkage that as society, we judge people who have addictions. We had for years, but the fact is that the majority of people who are addiction are struggling with their trauma, and this is their longer term coping, right, with this substance. So the good news is there really is a true way to heal childhood trauma, but it's it requires us to do something that we're not accustomed to doing, which is to turn towards our experience versus to try to run away from it. Because most of the time in trauma, when pain or anxiety arises, when a difficult or painful feeling arises, our nervous system will very quickly try to push it out of the way. We'll either get activated and think about doing other things, or we'll go into a retreat and want to lay down and pull the covers over our head. But you need to learn a different way of relating to your experiences versus running from them or fighting them.
Let me ask you a question. You said something that really got my attention, that our nervous systems are stuck in the past. And I thought, yes, that's it. The nervous system energy running through my body doesn't get present time. I can say to myself, you're safe, everything's fine right now, look around you. But there's some part of me that just doesn't believe it, even when I say the words. How do we bring our nervous system into present time reality?
And that's a great question. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when we get hijacked. If we're in anxiety, any state, anxiety, anger, or shame, for example, those three, we're usually caught in a flowing stream of thinking, story, narrative about how bad I am, or about the other person is, how bad the other person is, or how I was unfairly treated. And we're very much involved in the story. We're not even paying attention to what our body's doing, how tense it's getting, how hot it's getting, how much energy is in it. We're swirling around in the story. This is what carries us. This is the tendency of the nervous system. If you're detecting non-safety, which is what's happening when you're feeling uncomfortable, your nervous system wants to protect you by keeping you in that state so that you're vigilant, you don't become relaxed, and you try to identify any particular threat as it might come your way. But this doesn't leave us any time to react, right? To react in what's really happening. We're reacting to the way that our nervous system is still interpreting everything that occurs now through the lens that it learned in the past. right? Um, there's a term in polyvagal theory called neuroception, which is the ability for me to perceive, to neurocept someone else's state of their nervous system, right? We all have this, right? This is that ability to sense other things. We see this in nature when 10,000 elk are grazing at a lake and a twig breaks and all 10,000 heads of the elk turn in unison at the same time. That's a global sensing of nervous system. We all have that capacity. But if I've had trauma, instead of perceiving safety or danger, which would be accurate, and I can do that, I also have a tendency, once I've had trauma, to have inaccurate neuroception, which could be that either, Tami, I would see you as a very dangerous person when you're not, or I could see you as perfectly safe, even though you're actually, in truth, very dangerous. I would either be projecting one piece of my past or the other, either denial of danger or the danger. So part of coming back into our bodies is to ground a little bit and begin to have the ability to shift into a state of ventral, of a little bit more presence and grounding, which then actually lets us relate to what's going on versus being driven by it. That's really what changes these things. So one of the things that we talked about when we wanted this program a few years ago was it was really important for us to build a program that was truly transformational, not just educational, not just giving more concepts, because clearly with trauma, concepts can help, but they don't heal. And so we built this whole program around the idea of giving people a guided, safe experience towards continually dropping into their bodies and beginning to, in class, with material, in discussions in live groups, to be able to track themselves and other people. So we start to actually live from this perspective. It's not just a conceptual thing. We're actually feeling our way in. We're becoming more embodied. And again, that's another thing, like trauma splits us from our awareness, it splits us from our essence, and it often splits us from our body. And so healing is a returning of gathering of our awareness, a return of our true essence, or accessing it in some way, and a re-inhabiting of our body. And the program is built around really taking everyone through that arc so that they can really land in their own experience and relate differently to themselves, differently to others, and differently ultimately to the world. Because right now, the world feels very traumatizing for all of us. But if you've had trauma, this level of pervasive unsafety in the environment stirs us. It stirs us and it makes us more reactive. It makes us more fearful. Or it could just make us more hopeless and just like, I want to pull the covers up and not deal with the world, right? These are, again, the ways that trauma from our past impacts how we can function and be present in this time.
Now, I mentioned in the introduction your 72,000 hours of clinical work. And here's the thing that I really want to understand and have you make very explicit, which I don't fully get, which is if you were to explain to me, Tami, here's the map of the healing trauma journey. When someone goes from, they have some level of awareness and understanding of their early childhood trauma to actually being the person who says, I healed it. It's in the past now. I know it's in the past. And here I am. My nervous system is in present time, healed. It's past. What did they go through? What kinds of skills did they develop? How did they change to get to that point?
That's a great question. So there's several things that work together to help someone move in that direction. And one thing is repeated experience in becoming embodied and repeated experience in tracking and noticing your own states, your own place on the map. So we provide everyone, this is our teaching, we teach this sort of polyvagal map of different levels of arousal in the defensive states, the high and the low energy defensive states, and that we really help people understand and see in real time that trauma survivors spend a good deal of their energy dysregulated, either in sympathetic activation or dorsal shutdown. And we're really helping people both notice where they're getting stuck. And once you've gotten the message about why anything that's coming up is coming up, you're able to also begin to shift towards a more regulated state. So part of this is really living inside the body and actually being with our experience as it unfolds and cultivating a capacity to be less reactive, less spontaneously harsh, judging, shaming to whatever we're feeling, and to begin to turn towards it with a sense of friendliness. And these things can be developed, but they take time. You just don't do this in a day or a weekend, which is, again, why the 9 months for this process was critical to really be able to help people drop into themselves and begin to work from the position of being connected with their body, which changes the way you relate to the states themselves, to yourself, and to others. You begin to see that you're not your states. When I was a kid, I was so anxious all the time. I just thought I was anxious. And that still is a part of me. But I realized I was always in flight. And it's not like my job is to calm down my ability to have flight. My job was to eventually realize I'll need flight at times, but I don't want to always live there. So I want to be able to learn how to live more from a sense of presence and wakefulness, right? So I don't see really ultimately a huge difference between the spiritual journey and the healing trauma journey, because they're both really about giving us increasing degrees of freedom, increasing connection with ourselves, and ultimately, because all trauma survivors have to deal with shame, that there's a necessary component of self-compassion that needs to be generated. And that's actually one of the most challenging things for many trauma survivors to have is, at least initially, is any sense of kindness or friendliness towards themselves. That's hard. Most trauma survivors have no problem doing that to others they care about, but they have great problems offering that to themselves.
You know, Dr. Rutstein, in every conversation I've had with you where we've gone into any depth about healing from trauma, you always bring up the topic of shame. And at first I thought, oh, this is kind of Dr. Rutstein's expertise. This is his specialty. He focuses on the healing of shame. And as you and I have talked about, that's been a very important part of your own healing path as a person. And thank you for being just so confessional and forthcoming about that. But over time, over these past few years of working together, I've come to see how much shame is actually present as an experience when I'm feeling nervous system dysregulation, and how when I do the practices that you teach around this immersing ourselves in a field of love and care that is always available to us. It's essential in our nature, how much it shifts things. So I wonder if you can talk about that and how it is that you see becoming aware of shame and healing shame as so essential on this path of healing, specifically from childhood trauma.
Well, yeah, I think that, first of all, going back a bit, trauma was one of the first diagnoses the therapist would share with their clients. Most of the time, we wouldn't go into medical or to technological descriptions or diagnostic descriptions. We might use that for insurance purposes, but it didn't have necessarily a heavy need in the therapy, but trauma did. Because unless someone understands they had trauma, they will feel they're either crazy or broken. And it's really important to help people understand that actually something occurred. It impacted you psychologically, but it also impacted you nervous system-wise, biologically, somatically, and that it can take us a while to heal our emotional wounds, our psychological wounds, but it can take even longer to help the nervous system return from a chronic state of on-guardness, defensive states. And what I have found in my own work is that there's a couple of distinct phases of therapy, and one of them is just helping people initially understand they had trauma, and it has these impacts on you. But the other one, especially when people are no longer having as many symptoms as trauma, their life is not as fragmented, disruptive, or threatened with dysfunction at times. They're more functional. They're able to feel like they have a life, but they harbor this sense of not enoughness inside. The things that I saw lasting longer were the shame. the shame was almost universal in every person that I kind of worked with after trauma. That seemed to be the thing that kept them from moving on. And like you were saying, Tami, it was only recently that you noticed, oh, when I start paying attention to my anxiety, I can see that there's a little aroma of shame in there somehow, right? But so many of us have the anxiety, get shaming of ourselves for being anxious when there's no reason. And we don't even think of it or look at it as shame. We're just thinking of it as, I'm too anxious, and that's wrong. But if we begin to see, no, you need to understand shame and use it as a way of framing and seeing what's there. Shame is a state, it's a distortion. So just like I wouldn't trust everything I think when I'm enraged, we shouldn't trust most of what we think when we're in shame. It's always going to be horribly against us. So that insight alone is helpful, but it's not curative. What's curative is then, like you said, if I'm in a state of shame and I can connect with a sense of care, either towards myself or being loved by, co-regulating with the world or the universe or God, right? My shift, my change, my state shifts. I go out of shame, and all of a sudden, I'm not in that little nightmare of me being a bad person. I'm not shrunk anymore. I'm kind of human again. The problem, in effect, dissolves when we connect with a sense of self-compassion or loving compassion towards us. Again, if we're deep in shame, we will not be able, we'll have a very hard time receiving love from other people. And that's also something to work with, is our own ability to give affection towards us or care, and our own ability to receive it from others. Again, most of the trauma survivors I work with are some of the most loving people you would ever imagine. They're kind and thoughtful and sweet, and they don't give the time of day to themselves in a lot of ways.
Can you give us a very practical suggestion for receiving shame when we do have enough space to say, oh, receiving love, receiving that love when we feel shame? Can you give us a practical suggestion for how we do this? There's enough space. I can see that's what's going on. I'm punishing myself. I'm hard on myself. I want to interrupt this.
So one of the ways that I would do it is, again, everything, it's helpful to be framed or seen through the eyes of care. So if you listen to your shame, if you actually listen to the voice, my experience of shame is a very young version of me screaming, don't do this. You shouldn't have done this. You're going to get killed. It is absolutely terrified. And at the end, when I start hearing that, I can start identifying with and having compassion for that tortured young part of myself that felt that he had to be perfect to be okay, to survive. And so what I'll do then is I'll usually put a hand on my heart, one or two hands, and I'll simply say, you don't have to worry about that right now. It's okay. People make mistakes. This is okay. But that'll only have impact if those two things are done. First of all, I have to see shame as shame. And doing that, I also have to return to a little bit more of connection with me. It helps to place one or both hands on your heart. And then notice the way that I was even saying it, I was embodying that sentiment. So it's not like, it's okay, it's not your fault. That's not going to go anywhere, right? But if I can dip into a little bit of inner regulation to offer it, in effect, to another part of me that's in shame, what happens is my whole system settles. So the key here is, again, to do things from your body, from your heart, to be aligned with them. That has all the difference in the world. One of the things that is a very big part in trauma therapy is this self-regulated presence of the therapist, right? The self-regulated presence of the therapist allows the other person to begin to feel safe enough to inquire into their own dysregulation. So this is something I've learned by necessity over years, but it has a tremendous impact. The more regulated I am, the more we can communicate that regulation just by our presence or by our tone of voice. And that this is something that people can learn to do for themselves and for those that they love. Because so much of what goes on is we come home and our spouse or our child is in despair because of something happened at school. And we're pressured because we got to start dinner, or we got to do something else, and we have to take care of their need. And we could also take the moment to just be with their pain and ours. that they're needing something, we want to respond to them, and we're also needing something, we're feeling pressured. And then what's the kindest way to respond to both of them? Is a different tack than, I don't know what to do. You got to give me some time. And which, of course, we'll do at times, we're human. But the idea is moving into your body gives you an expanded way to respond to all of your life. And that's the way of healing from trauma, is reclaiming our body, reclaiming our life, and stop believing in and living from this inner sense that we're unworthy, that we're not enough, that we're shameworthy.
Now, we're getting some terrific questions from participants, and I'm going to try to bring in as many as I can. You're also invited to add your questions either below the player page or in the chat. We have a question from Siobhan who writes, when I'm overwhelmed and become angry at the world, I find it incredibly difficult to check in with myself. I retreat and engage in numbing activities. Can you share some practices to access and explore anger safely when I'm so dissociated?
So what you're noticing, Siobhan, is a really natural reaction from high activation and anger, and then our nervous system's wanting to break from that and go down towards shutdown. So we get numb, we dissociate, we get flat. And so the first thing is to recognize that the anger feels unsafe and that your body is doing just what it does to help the body feel safer, which is to shut you down. So the idea is we're not supposed to like overrule the body. No, I don't care. I'm going to do this anyways. That's kind of forcing it. The idea of what we want to promote is partnership, is working with your body. So if you're shut down after anger, you may want to spend a little time letting yourself feel the shutdown, maybe not days or months, but a few minutes, a half hour. And then if you feel like you'd like to shift a bit, one of the best things when we're very low energy and dorsal is movement. So physical movement, calisthenics, walking, running, lifting weights, cleaning, vacuuming, going for a long walk outdoors, toning, chanting, breathing exercises, reading poems at the top of your lungs. These are things that can bring energy up and can help you come out of that dorsal place. Then, right, then the next step is to see if you can stay in that more regulated place and touch into some of the anger. What you're going to find, though, is that there still is fear in your system about having too much anger. And I think that this is a combination of shame and fear. Probably anger was dangerous when you were a kid. When you're in dorsal and you feel like that shutdown place, feel like you can do some movement, splash water on your face, sing, chant, that will help raise some energy. And if you then want to, from an embodied place, begin to feel into a little bit of the anger, just to get curious about what is it that sets me off with this. But again, that's going to be something you're going to take time with. There's no quick fix to that. It's forming a relationship with your own fear and working towards relaxing that fear, which, if we work through the body, is imminently doable.
One of the questions that comes up for me, because you've said several times that part of the key steps in the journey here involve coming into greater embodiment. So now I recognize some form of dysregulation. I recognize that my nervous system, I don't feel safe. So
Right.
I'm willing to come into the embodied experience and I feel this racing heart or this stomach that's turning. I feel whatever it might be, heaviness and dullness inside. It could be all kinds of things.
Sure,
I'm
sure.
embodied now, feeling these sensations that don't feel very good. And they're continuing. I'm with them, they don't feel good. I'm with them, they don't feel good. What's the transformation part?
Okay, so when we teach coming in, we first teaching go to neutral parts of the body, like points of contact. So like right now, if people just want to feel points of contact where your body is making contact on the surface that you're resting or reclining on. And also, perhaps, if it feels comfortable, to notice the movement of the breath, how the body expands and contracts with each breath. So we're gently orienting people back into sensation. And then from there, we can invite people to notice, is there anything in your body right now that feels a little anxious? Is there a little extra energy in the chest or the throat or the abdomen? And then we encourage people to be able to be with it, to allow their awareness to be with the anxiety without trying to make it go away or amplify it. And what happens is if you're really able to stay with sensation and not go back into the story, but really just stay with sensation, the sensations will morph. They will not stay consistent. So even just noticing that there's an undulation of intensity is helpful, because a lot of times we just think our pain is always steady state. My terror is always steady state, and it isn't. But we won't know that until we actually watch it. And once we're watching it, once we're with it, what happens is as they morph, they usually also diminish. And they'll diminish as long as we're okay with letting things subside. But this is also where, you guessed it, shame and the nervous system work together. As we let arousal down, sometimes people will say, I start to meditate and then I get more anxious. Well, that's only because mostly because you're quieting down external noise. And what's arising then is what you haven't been paying attention to necessarily, this anxiety level you live with that's just not in full consciousness. So turning towards our feelings and forming a relationship, which again is a time, it's a practice and a time, it's not a one and done, but that's what becomes transformative. That I can't make feelings or states go away with my mind, but I can inhabit them totally differently if I'm in my body. And in my body, when I'm grounded in my body and aware of what I'm thinking and feeling, I have much more freedom of choice and empowerment than if I'm locked in a state, if I'm just fury, or if I'm just terror. I'm stuck.
A question came in from Nancy. Is there a link between childhood trauma and nightmares as an adult? For example, I'm 60 years old and have done a lot of work in therapy and have transcended a lot of limiting themes. But if there's something that triggers fear in our news or culture in the environment, I'll have childhood fear-based nightmares, and it's right back in front of me.
Yes, yes. So, yes, one of the really common signs and symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is having frequent nightmares, because most adults don't have frequent nightmares. Lots of trauma survivors do. And what you're also saying is that we find that when an anxiety or an issue in the world is occurring that has a resonance with some theme from our childhood, violence or narcissism or danger or hatred, that we don't just receive it as news, it lands in our nervous system and it impacts us. And we're sometimes only aware of that by when you wake up the next morning and you realized you had 2 or 3 nightmares that had these themes from your past. So to me, that's a message that says that your nervous system is trying to process, is this dangerous or safety? And it's feeling like it's more in danger. And it's trying to work some of this out at night. And that's fine. It's not a bad thing. But one of the things you can do is before you go to bed, you could work on soothing your body. If we go into bed with sort of our activation from the day, we'll still fall asleep, but the activation will have even more of an impact on our sleep. But if you spend 10, 15, 20 minutes before you go to bed and do something deliberately relaxing, soothing, a long bath, a hot bath, doing some meditation, listening to a relaxation practice, any of those things that takes the edge off the nervous system before you go to sleep reduces its potential impact into the night. So that's one thing you can try. And the other thing in the daytime is to work on these fears that are being activated by outside events and turning your awareness towards the fear that begins to inhabit you during the day as you read the news. That can also work long term.
Is it fair to say, Dr. Rutstein, that it's this development of a new form of, I'm going to use the word sort of self-intervention, that we, over time, if we do these kinds of new ways, new behaviors, we spend 15, 20 minutes before bed soothing ourselves, calming ourselves, the kinds of things you're mentioning. If we do it repeatedly enough over time, that's what creates the healing. Is that sort of part of the core design of the 9-month program?
Yes, yes, it is. It is very much grounded in the idea that our nervous systems are still impacted by trauma, and the only way that's going to really heal them is by changing our relationship to our nervous system and by changing the way that we react to and respond to, relate to what goes on in our nervous system. And it can't be done by hate. It can't be done by division. It can't be done, well, I hate this part of me and I have to stop waking up and I have to stop having those panic attacks. That just provokes them, it promotes them, it keeps them going. So what we teach is we teach a slow and steady way to begin to befriend your body and your experience, and in particular, your abandoned parts, the aspects of you that you feel you had to disown because they were labeled shameful.
We have a Renata writing in, can I help my partner recognize when they are in shame? And would it be helpful to do so?
It can, as long as you say it in a non-shaming way, because that could be a real trigger. Like if you approached and said, hey, it seems like you're giving yourself an unfairly hard time. It's like you're shaming yourself, you're blaming yourself. And if that can feel supportive to the person, that can bring their awareness to something that's not going on. But if you say, you're shaming yourself again, you really ought to not do that. That's actually just going to shame someone for having shame. So if you can do it in a way that actually does not increase shame and comes from a true caring part of you to help them reduce their suffering, there's a better chance that they'll receive it. But again, even if you bring this up, sometimes people are so unaware of their own level of shame, they'll deny it, or they become so ashamed of thinking they have shame that they deny it. So again, you can try this. And what I would say is you see how the response is. Is it helpful or does it cause more suffering?
Carla writes in, I have large blank periods of time in my memory of childhood. I've had a few come back unexpectedly, and it felt like it just happened now. This has been very hard to cope with, and I'm scared of what I might remember next. Any suggestions?
Yeah. So it's not uncommon when our childhoods have been very difficult or very traumatic and abusive to have large amnestic pieces of our past. I've worked with several people who have no memory from below the age of 10 or 11, and some people with no memory below 14. So that's not uncommon. Yes, things will return. The idea is things, even if they're forgotten, they're not gone. They may not have conscious memory of them, but they're still in our nervous system. They're still taking up space, making us contract in certain ways, making us react in certain ways. So one of the things you can do is, again, it's a process, but you can try to have compassion towards the part of you that gets frightened when things come up, when you remember things. It's also helpful sometimes to be able to remind yourself, we lived through this. It's not happening now. Because remember that, as Tami said before, the nervous system doesn't really recognize time, so it can't tell then from now. When the nervous system has a reaction, it's reacting to something, but it can't differentiate if it's in this moment or if it's 60 years ago. That's where we have to work with our nervous system to be a balance. Because my nervous system can get all caught up in something, and I'm the one that's got to go, oh, wow, like I'm really running at full speed over this, and why? Right? But I'll only get that information if I'm aware of what my nervous system, my body is doing.
Louise writes in, my dad was a Marine, and I feel like he shared his war PTSD with me and my siblings. Can I get this out of my system, even though this was his experience?
Yes, yes, you can. The good news is you can heal from trauma. Healing from trauma is really, really possible. And many of us may have our own direct trauma and family members' trauma. Some of us don't have our own direct trauma. We just have to live with people who had their trauma and couldn't control it. But the idea is you're beginning to see that some of the things your nervous system is doing is still reacting to and from him, even though it's been years or decades since you were that formative in your youth to be that influenced by him. So part of this would be, again, settling in, because whenever you are reacting as your father would, you're in a defensive position, right? Whenever I hear my mother coming out of my mouth, I'm angry or afraid, usually angry. That was my mother's favorite place. So I'm assuming if you're saying things in a way you'd rather not or whatever, that something is triggering in you, that something is activating in you. And what you want to do is kind of turn towards that and understand, I must be dysregulated if I'm thinking or feeling this right now. And that doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that it may not be the full truth. It's a piece of it. It's a piece of your experience, right? I can't see my whole experience if I'm enraged. I can only see a teeny piece of it. If I relax a little bit, I can then see, oh, you know what? I contributed to this. Oh, and they actually didn't say that and that. I thought they did. Like, we have an ability to be more flexible. We have an ability to respond to events versus react. If you are in a defensive position, you can only react to events. You can't respond to them, right? You're going to be automatic. So trauma takes our life out of our own hands in some ways. It takes us out of the driver's seat. And if we spend a lot of time in defensive states, we're not driving our life. Our fear, our rage, or our withdrawal is driving our life. And maybe it's not driving 100% of your life. For some of you, it is. For some of you, it might be driving your life 60% or 10% or 5%. But the idea is, at some level, unless you've worked on this piece of your trauma, this is what still propagates. And this is healable. This is healable.
Cameron writes in, any advice for those who have become caretakers of the parent who caused a lot of trauma in their childhood?
That's really, really tough. To force to be, in some ways, a better parent to your parent than your parent ever could have been to you is hard. It takes a generous heart to do that. And it also feels kind of like you never get your due. You're always the one taking care of others. And now you have to take care of someone who is the source of some of your deepest wounding. So it's going to cause a whole lot of feelings. You're going to have anger at yourself, anger at them, resentment. You're going to go dorsal and want to not deal with this. So one of the things you can lean into with this is just to feel and to acknowledge and be with the pain of this, the felt unfairness of this, right? That they get to hurt me for most of their lives, and now I have to take care of them for the end of theirs. That doesn't feel fair. It doesn't feel respectful. And just to be with those feelings. Because if you're still going to care for your parent, you're going to be able to do it better if you're with you versus if you're just focused on what you have to do. If you can include you in the equation, it will actually be less torturous for you.
Kim writes in, I had a fearful, violent childhood and seemed to attract relationships that reinforce the trauma. Why?
Well, it's because we pick what's familiar. So many people have had, say, a narcissistic parent, and then they marry a narcissist, or they had an alcoholic father and they marry an alcoholic. It's as if we somehow also know how to handle certain people's wounds. So if we got trained in our childhood how to handle the wounds of our parents, and we date someone later in life that has similar wounds, part of us will know how to work with that. Part of us will just go into taking care of that person or being with that person because we know that wound. Shame is what gets in the way from us thinking you deserve better, that you don't have to put up with dysfunction or wounding or being hurt, that you can actually pick and deserve to be with a person that you feel supported by, respected by, loved by, encouraged by. instead of tolerated, demeaned. Because again, tolerated, demeaned, that goes in the realm of shame and trauma, right? And what we want to help you do is question what's keeping you from making a healthier choice, a choice of more love.
S. Arvinda asks a question that I feel like has been slightly under the surface during this whole conversation that we're having about healing childhood trauma, which is healing an ongoing process or does it ever have an end? Dr. Rutstein, will I ever be healed? I graduate from the 9-month program. I take it again as an alumni. Is there an end to the healing process?
Yes. Yes and no. In one perspective, healing is a lifelong journey because like there's the healing of not having the intrusive symptoms, the massive dysregulation all the time. Then the subtler healing is these things of self-concept, of the shame in my self-concept put blinders on my eyes so I can't see what's possible. And you can work through that and you can make progress and heal, but you'll find that there's always a little bit more. And it doesn't feel like it's never done. I mean, to me, my healing is just part of my path. I'll heal until I stop breathing and then I'll stop healing. Okay. That's what life is, right? That's an opportunity until you don't have the opportunity. But it's not like you have to be in the immensity of pain you are now until you're healed. The idea is that healing and the whole process of healing should be a process of relief, a process of returning to yourself, a process of feeling more empowered, a process of feeling less crazy. So it's not like a one and done, but over time you notice this shift. So I still have shame sensitivities inside of me, and they can get activated, but it's nothing like it was years ago. And my anger issues, I was a rageaholic when I was younger. I'm not that way anymore now. So we can change and we can heal many things, but coming into a place of alignment, deeper connection, and ultimately love and compassion, which is why this is a spiritual journey as well. This is a lifelong. It's a lifelong, and that's not even about healing as much as growing, as much as deepening our growth. At some point, I'm not healing from trauma at this point in time. I'm trying to be a better friend to this life, to be a better friend than to this body, and to be a better friend to the person who's navigated this life so far. And if along the way I can do good, that's great. But it's not about so I can stop my trauma. It's more about so I can finally be okay more and more, just inhabiting me.
One question that comes up in several of the submitted questions in different kinds of ways is what keeps me from making a healthier choice when I know the right choice? So, for example, we were talking about sleep disturbances, and you recommended how helpful it would be before bed to take 10, 15, 20 minutes to breathe in a regulated way, to stretch. And I think many of us who have disturbed sleep, we know this would be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
We know it would be helpful, but we don't do it, or we only do it occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get over that hurdle? Why is the hurdle seems so big?
Right. Well, see, this is where shame comes in. We know how to eat. We know how to exercise. We know how to produce good sleep hygiene if we want to. We know how to be more successful, and we don't because it's about taking care of us. But if that same person who is having difficulties, right, had a younger family member at their house that was having trouble sleeping, I'm sure they might offer them warm tea or some warm milk, or, they would do a lot of things in their power to promote sleep because taking care of others, if you're ashamed, doesn't get in the way. If you have shame, what gets blocked is self-care. To me, self-care and self-compassion are almost identical. So if I'm not taking care of myself, it means that I'm not valuing what I need. I'm not valuing that I need anything. I'm just paying attention to what others need from me. Again, if you grew up in a traumatic family, that's a very, very adaptive way of being. It's just not a great way of being an individual in your adult life because you're not living for you.
And another question specifically about childhood trauma. How is the trauma from childhood different from, let's say, trauma that happens later in life? How does it impact us differently, childhood trauma specifically from later life trauma?
That's a great question, Tami. And that's one of the reasons, too, why healing childhood trauma is so much more difficult than healing, say, war trauma without a history of childhood trauma, or natural disaster trauma. A single event that's impersonal is often easier to heal than childhood trauma. One of the main reasons is that the majority of childhood trauma, not all of it, but the majority of it happens with intimate family members. Abuse, neglect, sexual, physical, emotional. And what happens is that there is often, when there's interpersonal trauma, when there is any crossing of the lines or neglect, there was always directly said or implied a shaming to the child. You deserve this. I'm doing this to you because of what you did. What you feel doesn't matter. What I feel matters. So an integral part of the abuse, besides being hurt or wounded, physically or emotionally, is they're also being blamed for being hurt. So it's like you get shot by a stranger and you're found in court to be guilty because you were walking in front of the gun. That's the setup that children go through. So what happens is it really messes up the young mind and the self of a child. It makes us believe we are bad, that there is no love for us, that if some people are hating us this much, there must really, truly be something wrong with me for people to hate me like that. And so those beliefs go so deep into our system. That's why this keeps going for so many years. That I worked with a woman who was in her late 70s, and she said this is the first time in her life she has stopped hating herself. And to me, that's a wonderful step. It's sad that for 77 years she just knew that she hated herself and she felt powerless to do something about it. So I know that this journey is a little different for everyone else, and childhood trauma sinks so deep in the way that we see ourselves in the world. That's why it takes consistent inward looking to see what keeps us getting turned around. Because otherwise, we just pay attention to our thoughts. We'll never see what's going on in our nervous system.
I notice, especially in your answer to this last question, that I felt stirred up and could sense perhaps within our group, with our participants, a sense of being stirred up, talking about the profound impacts of childhood trauma. And I wonder here, before we close, Dr. Rutstein, if you can help us all come together, if you can support us as a group in finding a place of calm regulation through your guidance and in your presence here before we close the webinar.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So you may have noticed that during us saying things throughout today or in the past few minutes, there may be some stirring, like Tami was saying. And I would invite you to just right now, if it feels comfortable, let your eyes close down and turn your awareness inside and down towards points of contact. Feeling where your butt meets the chair, your back and your arms are resting on whatever. This moment, seeing if you can sense the presence of your body here and now, without judgment, without editorializing, seeing if you can feel, sense your body here now, breathing. And if there's a place of some stirring inside of you, I invite you to put one or both hands on whatever part of the body may still feel a little activated. Maybe you have a little flutter in the chest or a tightening in the belly. Or for some of us, we'll have a constriction around the throat when we get anxious. And just wherever you're placing your hands right now, just notice the sensation of your hands meeting your body. And also of your body receiving your hands, seeing if you can allow yourself to focus on the sensation of that contact. You don't have to do anything with it. See if you can just rest there, being with the sensation of this perhaps pleasant, gentle, warm contact. And now also just notice the state of arousal in the body. You may notice that it's more settled, or perhaps some of the activation is dissolved completely. And all that we've done is shift our attention to move directly into sensation. And so when you're ready, you can let your eyes open up. How'd that feel for you, Tami?
Well, I noticed, Dr. Rutstein, that whenever I just simply attune to the wavelengths of your mellifluous voice, your beautiful voice, I feel calmer and more present and more grounded. Thank you. And
Thank
I
you.
am curious about something, which is I know that you are able to offer your co-regulating presence when you work one-on-one with people. How have you been able to design that force of group regulation into the 9-month program? How does the 9-month journey offer that sense of ongoing co-regulation to the participants?
So we built the course with that in mind. And we have 5 opportunities for live interaction every month. There's 2 office hours that I do, where we can ask questions about anything from the course content to how it's landing in your own body and work with that. There's one time I have a going deeper, and we take the material and go deeper. But in each of these community interactions, we regulate, we connect with one another. And the invitation is always to be, even in conversation, even in interaction, to also paying attention to what's occurring inside. And we also have 2 additional practice sessions led. So 5 times a month, people learn in community and can get supported in embodying these deeper and deeper and being able to share whatever obstacles or struggles they're having with finding their way into their body. We really want people, we design this to give maximum support in a group to people doing this journey.
Again, friends, I want to let you know that our 9-month online healing trauma program, we only run it once a year, and it's starting in early February. The final early registration deadline is January 31st. You can learn more. There's a link in the chat or below the player page. I also want to let you know that there are scholarships available. So don't let financial barriers be a barrier for your joining in this program. At Sounds True, we are thoroughly, wholeheartedly committed to training as many of us as possible in working with our own trauma and developing the skills of self-regulation so that we can feel safe in our nervous systems and offer that safety to others. It's so important, not just for us, but for our families and our communities and the world. and we're wholly committed to this. So if you go into the FAQ section on the registration page, there's a link for scholarship applications. Don't hold back. We'd love for you to join us. Dr. Rutstein, I always learn from you, and the healing journey deepens with your guidance and presence. Thank you so much. You're such a generous and loving soul. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Tami. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for being with us, and take good care. Sounds
Bye.
true. Waking up the world. Thank you.